There's nothing more deeply rooted in the human experience than the need for revenge, right? Maybe that's pessimistic, but think about our biblical stories from Cain and Abel and onward. Think about our cultural references, Inigo Montoya, many others, right? If you have more than one child, or if you have a sibling, you know the urge for revenge, right? It's deeply grounded in our bones. Revenge runs deep, and it tends to escalate, right? So if I have a friend, if one of my girlfriends is hurt or treated badly by her significant other, my initial response is, what's his address, and let's go slash his tires, right? It tends to escalate. You can think of impulses like that. Don't worry, I'm not going to do it. I wouldn't do that. But that is the impulse. So today we have a reference to the lex talionis, the law of retaliation, the attempt on the part of the Hebrew Bible authors, along with other ancient authors, to stop the escalation, right? To keep things fair. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. That's the rule, right? If I pluck out your eye, you can't cut off my head. We got to stop the cycle. It's in Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. It's in Babylonian law. It's in early Roman law. And there are a ton of examples if you are feeling nerdy and you want to look back at like Exodus or Deuteronomy where, you know, if you dig a hole and you don't, you know, you cover it where it can't be seen and someone's cow falls into the hole and dies, you need to buy them a new cow. Give them one of yours, right? You can't go and kill that person for tripping your cow, but you got to like repay it. A cow for a cow, right? An eye for an eye, a cow for a cow. There's another really great example that is a little bit, not super relevant, but I'm going to say it anyway because it matters for who we are as a church. In Exodus 21, right around this eye for an eye rule, there's an example of a pregnant woman. If a pregnant woman is struck, and it causes a miscarriage, you pay a fine to the husband, right? We're back in ancient Hebrew land now. But if it kills the woman, then the rule is a life for a life. So it's a little bit of a difference between the fetus and the woman. The woman's life is a life for a life. The fetus carries with it a penalty for sure, but it's not the same. That's helpful for us as a reproductive freedom congregation, one of the places we go to see what our ancestors kind of thought about when life begins and those questions. But the point is, the punishment needs to fit the crime, right? We've got to keep things fair. But Jesus goes further, right? He says, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. He's quoting scripture here. But I say to you, do not set yourself against the wicked. Do not set yourself against evil is another way to translate that. And of course, we have the famous Martin Luther King Jr. quote where he said, if we're going to do an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, we will be a blind and toothless nation, right? We may be able to stop some escalation, but the cycle of violence continues. He learns that from Jesus. So, all right, let's take a look at some of these examples. Sometimes Jesus is kind of floaty, talking about living water in your bowels, and sometimes Jesus is very practical. And today we get a practical Jesus. So if you needed a change, here it is. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other cheek to them also. All right. This isn't Jesus telling you to roll over. It's telling Jesus is telling us to make a point, right? Confront someone who's being violent to you with their violence. Jesus is talking to a crowd full of underdogs, right? Poor folks, enslaved folks, women, children. This is from the Sermon on the Mount, what we're reading from today. And he says, when someone uses their power to abuse you, which happens all the time, right? Don't cower. Don't fight back. Give the other cheek, right? Make them mean it. Make them do it again. Make them see their own violence. Or even if they won't see it still, at least shame them publicly for it, right? Luke Powery says that Jesus here is teaching people to overcome humiliation by shaming those in power. Give them the other cheek. Make them mean it. The second example, if someone wants to sue you for your coat, let your other clothing go as well. If someone's trying to take advantage of you, don't take the bait, right? You already know they're not playing fair, so don't join them in that game. Don't oppose evil, expose evil. You want my coat? All right, have my shirt too. You want my shoes? Let me start stripping publicly, right? This makes a scene. It's not fighting, it's not giving in, it's making a scene. And I do have to tell you that as I was working on this sermon this week, I did come upon some attempts at revenge in my own household. And I said, well, you know what Jesus says about this? And so I started telling one of my kids this story and started throwing my shoes off, and he just thought it was hilarious and couldn't stop laughing. And the next thing I knew, he was upstairs, and his little brother had demanded some toy from him, and he had given him the toy and a bunch of other of his toys and started stripping, and it worked, y'all. It worked. The little brother was so confused by all this, I don't think he even remembered what toy he had demanded in the first place. So I'm saying I did not expect it to go that way, but I do have some proof here that Jesus' words work. The third example, if someone forces you to go 1 mile, go the 2nd mile too. Right? Judea, where Jesus is occupied. It's an occupied territory, occupied by the Romans. There are soldiers everywhere. They could force anyone to assist them with anything, and they did. This was a public display of their power over the indigenous people, right? Over a colonized people. So we see this really vividly at the end of the gospel when Jesus is carrying his cross and he can't do it anymore, and the soldiers grab somebody else to do it. Simon of Cyrene, he carries the cross the rest of the way. That's what's happening here. You can be pulled in at any moment for anything. And it's a tactic, again, to display control, to keep people afraid and in line. And Jesus is saying, don't take the shame that they're trying to give you, right? Change the terms of the game. They can't take from you what you are freely giving, right? So go the 2nd mile. Assert your own power, your own dignity. Keep walking, right? It's kind of exciting. In this part of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus offers us a handbook on nonviolent resistance. And it is revolutionary. It is far from instructions to be meek and mild. Jesus teaches us how to make a scene, like he's been doing throughout the Gospels, right? How to expose injustice and oppression. Now, you may not be faced with these exact scenarios. I hope you're not getting slapped in public or your cloak stolen. I'm not sure even what a cloak is in this context. I hope that soldiers are not, forcing you to carry their packs. But there are tons of everyday ways that folks in our world are taken advantage of, right? Are shamed, are abused, are exploited. Big ways and small ways, every day. And I know this because you guys told me. I made a Facebook post asking for examples of everyday ways this kind of thing happens, and I had like 50 comments within a few hours. People were ready to tell me what was going on. So I'll share a few of those with you. A lot of them had themes of sexism, as many of you know and have experienced, right? A woman going to get her car fixed and feeling like the shop might be taking advantage of her not having as much knowledge or know-how as she should, perhaps. Or comments to mothers in particular about their husbands babysitting the kids when they're out. Oh, is your husband? Oh, look at Super Dad over there with the kids doing like the thing that is just a normal parenting thing that you do constantly all the time, right? Anybody have that? Yes, I see some hands. Or a lot of older women came on to say that they felt oftentimes dismissed by younger women as not having, or being assumed to not have the experience that they had. Maybe younger women also came on to say they felt like they were treated like the intern, or every time they're told to smile, it makes them look prettier, right? It's this power move that is harmful. Another one that came up is, and this probably happens to everyone, but again, that happens to women all the time, is your idea, like maybe you say an idea at a meeting for your work and it's kind of ignored, and then what happens 5 minutes later? A man says the same thing, and it's the best idea ever, right? Your ideas are stolen at work. We've talked about ageism. Cultural appropriation came up in lots of different ways. I thought it was interesting. One was the ways that churches like ours, prioritize white ways of worship and white ways of preaching that can feel oppressive to folks that bring something different to the table that's just as valuable. Or one woman who's a Latina woman talked about a white woman that she heard referring to herself as chingona, right? Taking someone's cultural term and applying it where it doesn't belong, right? Applying it to yourself. And that being harmful, right? Cultural appropriation can come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. So what if we applied Jesus' teaching to some of those situations? Right? Our impulse is fight or flight, complain about it on Facebook. But what if we tried Jesus' way? Right? So what would that look like? I actually don't know. We might have to brainstorm a little bit. But if someone says something about your husband babysitting the kids, do you want to go get out your wallet and pretend to start paying him? Does that draw attention? That draws a little attention to the absurdity of that comment, right? Or if your idea is stolen at work, maybe you say out loud, "Oh, I'm so glad that you liked my plan. Would you like to borrow my notes before our next meeting so that you can get some more ideas as well?" You know, it can be a little cheeky, I think. Sorry, that's Bluey. I've got some Australian words in there. Jesus is cheeky. That's one of the morals of the story. For an older woman who is feeling dismissed, and when younger women are talking about fighting for women's rights or something, you might say, "Oh, that's cute." And then tell a story about how you chained yourself to the governor's gate or whatever it is, that the experiences that you've had that brings so much to the table, right? It exposes the situation, it asserts your dignity, and hopefully gives the other person a chance to see your dignity and your worth as well and to correct course. I was thinking about my friend who was talking about her white woman friend calling herself chingona, and I wondered what it would be like if she just started speaking to her only in Spanish from then on. Like, "Oh yeah, okay, you're one of us, okay, then here's where we're going with this," right? It would probably make the point. I don't know. Some of you I'm sure have much better ideas from your experiences of these, and I'd love to hear how you put those into practice as well. But there are bigger things too, right? There are bigger things that maybe aren't quite as funny or aren't quite as cheeky. Things like abuse, like a lot of intimate partner abuse doesn't happen out in public where you can just give the other cheek and expect anything to change, right? So what's the message from Jesus there, right? I think it's still expose it, right? If you tell someone, if you're in an abusive relationship, the way to break that cycle is still to expose it, to tell someone, let someone in on what's happening behind the scenes, right? Or thinking even bigger about racial discrimination. Think about the civil rights movement. They didn't fight. They didn't cower. There was nonviolent, direct action, very strategic and very powerful, right? Inspired by Jesus. It exposed abuse. It exposed inhumanity by just walking across a bridge, right? By sitting at a lunch counter. It puts the oppressor's violence on display for the world to see. So Jesus is saying, don't try to stand against evil. Don't try to play its game. Expose it, right? Beloveds, the good news for us, I think, from this is that God, your Creator, wants you free. God wants you free and flourishing. And in Jesus, God gives us some practical strategies on how to work toward that, right? You don't have to be stuck in cycles of harm forever. You don't have to stay seething with a need for revenge, but you also don't have to stay beating yourself up in shame. Fight or flight feel like our only options sometimes, but Jesus offers a better way, a different way, right? He doesn't ignore violence. He doesn't fight it on the same terms. He doesn't play by the world's rules. Jesus teaches us nonviolent, direct action. We can learn more about that from people who were inspired by Jesus, right? Like Martin Luther King Jr., like Gandhi, and others. How to expose oppression without becoming an oppressor, right? How to preserve our own humanity and our own dignity, and invite the person who is harming you to rediscover their humanity, right? Their dignity. Is this easy? No. When I told this to Dominic earlier in the week, he was like, what? That is so hard, right? But it works. Is it easy? No. Does it always work? Well, it depends on what you mean by work, I think. But is it what it means to follow Jesus? Yes. Yes, y'all. This is like as basic and clear as we can get. Can it transform the world? Yeah, I think that it can. As we say in our household, the only way to transform, or the only way to make a baddie into a goodie is through love, right? We have lots of Nerf darts and all kinds of, violent games that are played, but mom comes in with the love arrows and tries to turn the bad guys into good guys. And that is where Jesus is going with this next, right? It's not just be fair in your retaliation, and it's not just even expose injustice in a nonviolent way. The next step, the place that Jesus is going to land, is love, right? His very next paragraph in the Sermon on the Mount is love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. What does that mean, right? What cycles of harm are you stuck in? What habits in relationships do you need to break out of? Maybe in your parenting, maybe in your friendships, maybe with your colleagues. How can Jesus' words inspire you to change the narrative, to choose a different way of relating? And while we're at it, what bigger systems of harm, what bigger systems of violence are we trapped in, or do we feel trapped in? What bigger systems do we recognize? Climate change, right? The criminal legal system. War, for God's sake. How can we disrupt those systems? Draw attention to the injustice and not play by those rules. That's our task, church. That's our task. We don't have to follow the world's script, no matter how deeply it seems to be imprinted into our bones and our reactions and our way of being. Jesus teaches us active nonviolence, even love, right? It's the only thing that is going to transform enemies to siblings, or siblings to friends, maybe. Fighting's not going to do it. Backing down is not going to do it. Ignoring conflict is not going to do it. Only love can do that. And love is hard. Love takes practice. Love takes constant recalibration and course correction. And it transforms you. It transforms us, regardless of any other good that it does. Loving our enemies, claiming our own humanity, exposing injustice, helps us live full lives, true lives, as our full and whole and open selves. That is good news, y'all. So this week I want to end with a challenge. I want you to practice this. Maybe something really small, maybe something bigger, whatever comes to your mind. With your children, or with your friends, or with a politician that you really don't like, or maybe the person that flips you off as you accidentally cut them off in your car on the way home. Give them a little love heart, blow them a kiss. Do something to try to practice what Jesus is getting at here. Experiment with it. Experiment on your spouse, on your neighbor, whatever, and let me know how it goes. I want to hear from you how you disrupted a cycle of harm, big or small. How you did something unexpected, maybe made a scene, to show injustice that was happening. And let's see what we can come up with, right? If we all do some little act of nonviolent action, maybe we'll get enough practice to be able to do some bigger ones together in the future. That's my hope anyway. All right. So, beloveds, take a deep breath. Practice pausing your impulses. Tap into those depths and depths of God's Spirit that is already in you. You have what you need for this. And let's go out and love. All right, I'll hear back from you next week. Amen.